A significant legal case concerning machine gun restrictions under the Gun Control Act is now before the United States Supreme Court. This case has the potential to clarify important aspects of Second Amendment protections and resolve confusion that has plagued lower courts for years. The outcome could fundamentally reshape how courts analyze firearms regulations and determine which weapons receive constitutional protection. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals recently upheld the Gun Control Act's restrictions on machine guns, despite constitutional challenges based on the Second Amendment and recent Supreme Court decisions in Bruin, Heller, and other landmark cases. This decision came after the Department of Justice continued to defend the machine gun restrictions in court, maintaining its position that automatic weapons fall outside the scope of Second Amendment protections. Two federal district court judges had previously dismissed machine gun possession charges on Second Amendment grounds, creating legal uncertainty and conflicting precedents that this Supreme Court case may finally resolve. The divergence among courts has left both prosecutors and defendants unclear about how the law should be applied, making Supreme Court intervention increasingly necessary. The central case is United States v. Morgan, which originated in federal district court in Kansas. Mr. Tamori Morgan was charged with 2 counts of possessing a machine gun in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 922, a federal statute that has restricted civilian possession of automatic weapons for approximately 40 years. The charges involved an Anderson AR-15 rifle that prosecutors alleged was fully automatic and a device commonly called a Glock switch, which can convert a semi-automatic pistol into an automatic weapon. These items formed the basis of the federal prosecution against Mr. Morgan. At the trial court level, Mr. Morgan challenged the charges based on the Second Amendment, arguing that the federal prohibition on machine gun possession violated his constitutional rights. The district court judge carefully examined the issue and ruled in his favor, dismissing the charges in a decision that surprised many legal observers. The judge rejected the government's argument that the Supreme Court's Heller decision supports a complete ban on machine guns, finding the government's interpretation flawed on multiple grounds. The judge made several key points in this ruling. First, he noted that the government relied on language from Heller that was not central to that case's holding, but rather consisted of dicta, which are statements made by a court that are not necessary to the decision and therefore carry less legal weight. Second, the judge emphasized that machine guns were not the issue being decided in Heller, which focused primarily on handgun possession in the home for self-defense. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the judge stated that the Second Amendment applies to modern arms, not just those that existed when the Constitution was written in the late 18th century. This interpretation follows the principle that constitutional protections evolve to cover modern technologies, just as the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches applies to cell phones and computers despite these devices not existing at the founding. The district court judge also noted that the government provided surprisingly limited evidence at this stage to justify the federal law restricting machine guns. Rather than presenting a robust historical analysis or demonstrating that the restriction was consistent with the nation's tradition of firearms regulation, the government appeared to rely primarily on the assumption that machine guns fell outside constitutional protection entirely. This approach proved unsuccessful at the trial level, leading to Mr. Morgan's victory. The government appealed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, asking that court to reverse the district court's decision and reinstate the charges against Mr. Morgan. During oral arguments before the appellate panel, the Department of Justice relied heavily on language from Heller discussing M16 rifles and similar weapons as dangerous and unusual. The government's attorneys emphasized this characterization, arguing that weapons fitting this description could be banned without violating the Second Amendment. There was also extensive discussion about how to apply the Supreme Court's more recent Bruin decision and its analytical framework. Specifically, the courts wrestled with whether the in common use for lawful purposes standard should be applied at the first step of the analysis when determining if something qualifies as an arm under the Second Amendment's text, or at the second step when examining history and tradition. The 10th Circuit ultimately reversed the district court and ruled that machine guns are not protected by the Second Amendment. The appellate court concluded that Mr. Morgan's firearms did not constitute arms under the plain text of the Second Amendment because they could fire automatically. According to the 10th Circuit's reasoning, These firearms would only receive constitutional protection if Mr. Morgan could prove they are in common use today for self-defense. Because machine guns have been heavily restricted for decades, Mr. Morgan could not meet this burden, and the court found no Second Amendment violation. Mr. Morgan has now asked the Supreme Court to review this case through a petition for certiorari. His petition raises several important legal questions that have divided courts across the country. The petition identifies widespread confusion among lower courts about how to determine which weapons qualify as arms protected by the Second Amendment. Some courts begin with a presumption that all firearms are protected, while others exclude entire categories of weapons from constitutional coverage based on various characteristics, such as rate of fire, magazine capacity, or cosmetic features. The petition argues that the 10th Circuit's decision creates an unfair circular logic that effectively removes constitutional scrutiny from long-standing bans. A weapon banned for 40 years cannot be in common use precisely because it has been banned for 40 years. This reasoning means that individuals can never prove such weapons are in common use, and consequently, the government never has to justify its restrictions by demonstrating consistency with the nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation as required by the Bruin framework. Under this approach, the longer a ban remains in place, the more constitutional it becomes, regardless of whether the ban would have been permissible under the original understanding of the Second Amendment. The petition emphasizes that this case presents an excellent opportunity for the Supreme Court to clarify what weapons are protected by the Second Amendment's text. It asks the court to resolve conflicting approaches among lower courts, determine who bears the burden of proof in Second Amendment cases, and address whether the rate of fire affects constitutional protection. Mr. Morgan's attorneys argue that it cannot be constitutionally correct that his firearms do not constitute arms merely because they fire rounds more quickly than other identical firearms. After all, the fundamental function remains the same, projecting force at a distance, which is the core purpose of any arm. The case is now pending before the Supreme Court, and the court must decide whether to accept the case for review. The Supreme Court receives thousands of petitions each year, but only hears a small fraction of cases, typically selecting those that involve important legal questions or resolve splits among lower courts. This case appears to meet both criteria. Legal observers anticipate that the Department of Justice will continue to argue that machine guns are dangerous and unusual weapons that fall outside Second Amendment protection, maintaining the position it has defended throughout this litigation. This case represents a significant test of how the Supreme Court's framework for analyzing gun regulations applies to automatic weapons. The court's decision on whether to hear this case, and any subsequent ruling, could have substantial implications for Second Amendment law extending far beyond machine guns. The principles established could affect how courts analyze restrictions on other types of firearms and accessories, including so-called assault weapons, high-capacity magazines, and various firearm modifications. Lower courts have struggled to apply the Supreme Court's Second Amendment precedents consistently since the Bruin decision established a new analytical framework. Some courts exclude certain firearms from constitutional protection entirely based on features or capabilities, while others apply a more comprehensive analysis examining text, history, and tradition. Some courts place the burden on the government to justify restrictions, while others require challengers to prove that specific weapons deserve protection. This inconsistency has created confusion and unpredictability in Second Amendment litigation nationwide. This case could provide much-needed clarity on these fundamental questions of constitutional law. If the Supreme Court grants review and issues a decision, it would establish binding precedent for all lower courts and potentially resolve years of conflicting interpretations. The resolution of this case will likely influence firearms policy and regulation for years to come, affecting millions of gun owners and shaping the boundaries of governmental authority to restrict certain types of weapons.